you all as you are well, hello to you all as you are joining in on this call. I'm continuing to see names pop up in my sidebar, and that's really wonderful. We're celebrating the fact that you are all here tonight. Um, I'm sure many of you haven't met me yet, especially those of you who are not from the Valparaiso community, but my name is Pastor Kate, and I'm one of the university pastors here at Valparaiso. So it's my pleasure tonight to get to welcome you to this conversation, Open to Me the Doors of Repentance, Lent in the Eastern Church. It's my pleasure to introduce especially Dr. Nicholas Denisenko, who created this opportunity for us and who will be sharing the information with us tonight. Dr. Denisenko holds the Emil and Elfrida Yoakum Chair and teaches theology in Christ College and the Department of Theology. He specializes in liturgical theology, and he is also an ordained deacon in the Orthodox Church in America. Our plan for this evening is that Dr. Denisenko will speak for about half an hour, and then afterward we'll hold about half an hour also for an opportunity to ask him questions and follow up on the information he presents with us tonight. Because Zoom is strange, we're going to ask you to please mute your audio this whole time. It looks like most of you are doing that already, and also to turn your video off. And then when it comes to the Q&A time, if you do have a question or a comment that you would like to offer, you're welcome to put that in the chat box, and I'll be the one asking those questions of Dr. Denisenko when that time comes. So Dr. Denisenko, thank you so much for organizing this event tonight. I've been really looking forward to it, and I'm thrilled to be learning from you this evening.
Thank you so much, Pastor Kate. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. I'm really looking forward to our evening together. And we have a little bit of show and tell. So I have a PowerPoint to share with you. So just give me 1 second to bring that onto my screen so that we can do this together here. And I will then begin. So good evening to you all. So glad that you're able to join us. And I'm here to talk to you about Lent. Many of you who are here tonight are already in Lent. You started Lent by receiving ashes. You said goodbye to Alleluia until Easter. You have spent time thinking about things that you might give up for Lent. Maybe you'll embrace meatless Mondays. There's never a shortage of ways to help those in need. And as we all know too well, the demand of those in need currently outweighs the supply of those who can help. I'm here tonight to tell you about people that you might not know. Right now, millions of Eastern Christians throughout the world, Orthodox and Eastern Catholic, haven't started Lent yet. For now, I'll just refer to these Christians as Orthodox Christians for simplicity. This year, Orthodox Christians start Lent on March 15 and celebrate Easter, which we call Pascha, on May 2nd. The time separating Orthodox Pascha from Western Easter is long, and the reason for it is that the Orthodox Church uses a slightly different method of calculating the annual date for Pascha. That's a topic for another day. In fact, public service announcement here, I'll return to that issue on Thursday, April 22nd, when I give the second lecture of this series. So consider that your invitation to join us again for part 2 of Lent and Easter in Orthodoxy. Tonight, I'll be telling you about how Orthodox Christians observe Lent. The experience is somewhat different from that of the Western Church. Orthodoxy does not have Ash Wednesday. It has never been a part of our tradition. We don't say goodbye to Alleluia either. In fact, we sing it more often during Lent. We do say goodbye to some of our favorite friends, though. We bid farewell to beef, pork, chicken, and burgers. We say adios to eggs and cheese. You know you're Orthodox when it's pizza night and there's no sausage or cheese. I should say that we try to do these things. Sometimes we fall short. Ultimately, I'll try to get down to the meaning of it all, and this is something the Orthodox tradition has in common with the Christian West. Lent is a crash course on becoming human without a side of bacon. The remainder of this presentation introduces you to the primary features of Orthodox Lent. We'll discuss the pre-Lenten period that prepares each Christian for Lent itself. Then we'll turn to the rites that begin Lent, with Vespers on Forgiveness Sunday. A brief discussion of Clean Week follows, the intense first week of Lent. How Orthodox Christians observe Lent on ordinary weekdays is next. We'll talk about 3 liturgical events: the commemoration of St. Mary of Egypt with the canon of St. Andrew of Crete, the liturgy of pre-sanctified gifts, and the Akathistos hymn. We'll conclude by returning to the important theme, what Lent really means, before we move to Q&A. Let's begin with the basics. The Orthodox Church begins Lent on Monday of Clean Week, which is the first week of Lent. In practice, Lent begins on Sunday evening with Forgiveness Vespers, following the scriptural rhythm of evening beginning the new day, so each liturgical day begins with Vespers. Lent lasts for 6 weeks and includes Saturdays and Sundays. It ends in the Friday of the 6th week at Vespers. Lazarus Saturday and Palm Sunday follow before the Church begins her observance of Holy Week. By far, the most concrete experience Orthodox people have of Lent is fasting. It probably won't surprise you to know that fasting means refraining from foods for most people. If you read sociological surveys of how strictly Orthodox people observe Lent, you'll find that many people do not fast. The best way to describe the reality on the ground is that people try to fast to the best of their ability. The Church establishes a pattern or a blueprint for fasting, and people adopt it and then adapt it. There is some flexibility. Here's how it works. The pattern established by the Church for Lent calls for abstaining from meat, dairy, fish, alcohol, and olive oil on most of the days of Lent. There are a couple of exceptions. On a few days, fish, wine, and olive oil are allowed. The pattern communicates a fundamental message. Human life depends on God, not on an overabundance of food and drink. To sustain more intense prayer and more focus on God, there is also a general call to refrain from entertainment and get-togethers. The ideal invites the Christian to enter into a quiet, still place, free from the usual distractions to hear God speaking to them. As I said, people adopt and adapt this pattern. Not everyone can fast rigorously for health reasons. One dimension of Lenten observance is sadly overshadowed: to fast from gossiping and speaking ill of others. Lent is a time for quieting the passions. It is now customary for many Orthodox to sign out of social media apps during Lent. It is much more difficult to refrain from talking. Try it for one day. Observe a day in complete silence. Don't talk to anyone. This doesn't mean that we are to be rude, but to be quiet and still. Now, imagine if this quietness, stillness, and strict management of our tongues and our fingers, I'm thinking of our tapping on our social media apps, the stillness became normative for our daily lives. We'll return to this bold idea, Lent as normal, at the end. Now, how do we arrive at that point of being able to stop eating our favorite foods and refraining from gossip? If we just jump right into it, we're going cold turkey. To ease our way into Lent, we have a 1-month preparatory season of the pre-Lenten period. Now, depending on how you're counting, the pre-Lenten period consists of 4 Sundays. Some would say 5 Sundays because the Sunday of Zacchaeus, or the Canaanite woman in some Orthodox traditions, functions as a signal that it's time to get ready for Lent. The clearest signpost is the Sunday of the publican and Pharisee. This is the first pre-Lenten Sunday because it is on this weekend that the church begins to sing from the special book called the Lenten Triodion. The Triodion contains all of the special hymns appointed for each day of Lent, beginning with the Sunday of the Publican and Pharisee, all the way through Holy Saturday. The book is called Triodion because some of the hymnographical units assigned, which typically have 9 songs based on the 9 biblical canticles, have only 3 in this book. The hymns are attributed to diverse authors, often monks from famous monasteries in Palestine and Constantinople. The pre-Lenten period invites the participant to begin the process of transformation. On the Sunday of the Publican and the Pharisee, each one is invited to adopt humility, to turn to God and ask for mercy. The church begins singing a special hymn at Matins on this Sunday, one that has inspired some pretty schmaltzy musical settings over the centuries. The text is as follows. Following beginning Glory to the Father, open to me the doors of repentance, O life giver. For my spirit rises early to pray towards thy holy temple, bearing the temple of my body all defiled. But in thy compassion, deliver me, purify me by the loving kindness of thy mercy. Unto the ages of ages, lead me in the paths of salvation, O Mother of God. For I have profaned my soul with shameful sins and have wasted my life in laziness. But by your intercessions, deliver me from all impurity. Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy great goodness and according to the multitude of thy compassions, blot out my transgressions. When I think of the many evil things I have done, wretch that I am, I tremble at the fearful day of judgment. But trusting in thy loving kindness, like David, I cry to thee, have mercy on me, O God, according to thy great mercy. The hymn occurs in dialogue with the recitation of Psalm 51 and its verses. Have mercy on me, O God, appointed to all services of Matins. Now, going back to the pre-Lenten structure, the Prodigal Son Sunday invites all participants to recognize their sin, admit it, return home to God, and to be wary of becoming the envious older brother. On this Sunday, the church appends an additional setting of psalmody to the Matin service, Psalm 137, By the Waters of Babylon, the Song of Lament. Think of this period as liturgical self-examination. We're invited to admit our own sin, and Lent hasn't even started yet. The third Sunday is Meat Fair and the Sunday of the Last Judgment. If we begin the pre-Lenten period by begging for God's mercy, we now contemplate the divine commandment to be merciful to the least of his brethren. This Sunday reveals another aspect of Lent. Love your neighbor. This is the last Sunday for eating meat until Pascha. Here's the truth. It's not unusual to see carnivorous Orthodox men huddled over their smoking grills, producing savory smells and claiming that the smoke from the charcoal made their eyes watery, instead of shedding tears at saying goodbye to meat. The last pre-Lenten Sunday is about forgiveness, returning again to the Gospel of Matthew. The hymnography for that day is incredibly evocative. It depicts Adam, cast out of paradise and weeping in lament. The hymns assigned to this day invite the church to join Adam in singing, Woe is me. I always tell my students that they're lucky that Ash Wednesday is a much calmer version of its ancestor, the rite of solemn penance, which would entail the bishop driving you out of the church with his staff and sending you into exile until Holy Thursday. Today, Ash Wednesday is an enrollment of all into the order of penitence. The same is true of its Orthodox cousin, Forgiveness Sunday. It enrolls all participants into an order of penitence, whose penance is to learn how to give and how to receive forgiveness. But before talking about Forgiveness Sunday, let me say a quick word about that word you see on the screen, Cheese Fair. On the week before Cheese Fair Sunday, it is customary to have lots of dairy. You're out of luck if you're lactose intolerant like me. I think that many Orthodox have a kind of unofficial celebration of Mardi Gras or Fat Tuesday on one of these final pre-Lenten days. One rather charming tradition that continues to this day is the so-called Maslenitsa, which usually consists of dancing, music, and socializing over a dinner of Russian-style crepes. This photo depicts a woman making crepes or blini for a Maslenitsa festival in St. Petersburg in 2018. The rite of forgiveness begins Lent. It takes place at the conclusion of Vespers on Sunday night. This service in practice is often moved earlier in the day so that people who are in church don't have to go home and come back again. Now, during the rite of forgiveness, there's a moment of liturgical drama. Every celebration of Vespers includes the chanting of the prayer, "Count us worthy, O Lord, to keep us this evening without sin." It is customary for parishes to change the liturgical color from gold to purple during the chanting of this prayer, a visible symbol that Lent has begun. The rite of forgiveness itself happens at the end of Vespers. It is the descendant of a monastic practice, when the monks would bow down before one another and say, "Forgive me, a sinner," responding with, "God forgives and I forgive," and then exchange the kiss of peace with the prostration before beginning the 40 days. And just briefly, the mosaic on the right that you see is a mosaic of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise. As my students know very well, this is an actual iconographic depiction of the cherubim holding the flaming sword, keeping guard at the entrance to paradise. And so the church is invited to be like Adam, to sing, "Woe is me," before standing outside the entrance of paradise on this Sunday. Now, returning to Forgiveness Vespers in this rite that I just described to you, I want to stress that Orthodox parishes have multiple ways of observing this practice. In some parishes, the priest asks the people for forgiveness and bows down before them. They respond by bowing before him, and then he invites the people to exchange forgiveness with each other. A much more intense variant of this rite, which may have originated at the Valam monastery in Russia, has become quite popular, especially in smaller parishes. All of the participants form a circle and exchange forgiveness with each other, each person bowing all the way down to the ground in a full prostration. The experience is that you exchange forgiveness with each person who is present, even if you don't know them. It can be powerful, transformative, incredibly difficult, and overwhelming. It is very intimidating for introverts. During this communal exchange of forgiveness, the choir sings the hymns of Pascha. The rite that begins Lent gets down to the core of what Lent is: to forgive, receive forgiveness, receive God's amnesty, become part of a reconciled community, begin a new chapter, a new season by seeking reconciliation. I said at the outset that Lent establishes ideal patterns. An observant Christian strives to forgive and be forgiven through the course of a lifetime. There is no semi-Pelagianism in Orthodoxy. Each faithful person quickly learns that they will fall and fail during their journey to learn to forgive and to be forgiven. Forgiveness Sunday unleashes unfathomable divine power. It has the capacity to liberate participants so that they can begin the process of bidding farewell to the habit of sin. And so thus Lent begins. I will begin the rest of this presentation with an outline of the whole cycle of Sundays consisting of the following commemorations. As I said, Lent begins with Clean Week, and sometimes this is described as having your freezer cleaned out of all of those meats and cheeses so you won't be tempted to eat them. And literally, this is what people often do in preparation for a week, but it is a week to be free, to be liberated of all of the things that consume us. Public service announcement preview, I'm hoping next year to have a session on how to be free from the mental noise, the thoughts that irritate us. In a year from now, stay tuned. The first Sunday of Lent is the commemoration of the triumph of Orthodoxy. The second Sunday is St. Gregory Palamas, the great hesychast. The third Sunday is the Sunday of the commemoration of the cross. The fourth Sunday is St. John Climacus, also known as St. John of the Ladder. And the fifth Sunday of Lent is a commemoration of St. Mary of Egypt. And this leads to the end of the week of Palms, which goes into Lazarus Saturday with the Johannine reading of the raising of Lazarus and the entry into Jerusalem. Now, for those of you who are historically minded, you might note that the commemorations on the Sundays of Lent are somewhat recent in liturgical history. They represent important milestones in the history of the Orthodox Church. So the Sunday of Orthodoxy is like a Lenten incarnation feast, marking the beauty of Christ's presence among us when we venerate icons. It includes a rite of the triumph of Orthodoxy, which dates from the 9th century. Again, there are many variations of this rite. The feature is a procession of icons and the public reading of the Synodicon of Orthodoxy from the Seventh Ecumenical Council that in the year 787. Now, in some parishes, there is even a dramatic ritual intonation of anathemas set to ominous musical settings. If you don't believe me, look it up on YouTube and you will see what I am talking about. And of course, as always, handle this with care. Now, the commemoration of St. Gregory Palamas, and to a certain degree, Saints John Climacus and Mary of Egypt, point to a period of church history where monasteries, especially in Mont Athos, were the stewards of Orthodox liturgy and made the important decisions on its calendar. The themes of these Sundays are important, but it's a stretch to say that they're really Lenten. St. John and St. Mary exhibited influential patterns of the ascetical life, striving to overcome sin and becoming Christ-like through strict discipline of the body and fasting. There is one reason they're remembered in the later period of Lent: to inspire perseverance in fasting, vigil, and almsgiving among the faithful. It's remarkable that the pre-Lenten period is probably more Lenten in its theme than the Sundays of Lent themselves. Now, as for Lent, I want to focus on the features I mentioned in the beginning: daily prayer, the liturgy of pre-sanctified gifts, St. Mary of Egypt, and the Akathostos hymn. On the weekdays of Lent, faithful are to say a special prayer attributed to St. Ephrem the Syrian. The prayer is short, to the point, and involves powerful bodily gestures. It goes like this: O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth, despair, lust of power, and idle talk, followed by a complete prostration to the ground. But give rather the spirit of chastity, humility, patience, and love to your servant. Another full prostration. Yes, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own transgressions and not to judge my brother, for you are blessed unto ages of ages. Again, a full prostration to the ground. Now, there is a longer version of this prayer, one which includes the saying of, O God, cleanse me a sinner, with a quick bow to the ground, anywhere from 12 to 100 times, depending on the source that you're using, making the sign of the cross while reaching down with the right hand to the ground in a reverent bow. One then says the prayer of St. Ephrem one more time. The daily recitation of this prayer with the bodily gestures sometimes during multiple times of the day, reinforces the struggle of Lent and one's utter dependence upon God. This is truly a prayer of becoming and is one of the staple ascetical practices that has migrated from monastic cells to bedrooms, offices, living rooms, and even cars, though I do not recommend performing a prostration in the car for obvious reasons. The focus is again humility. The penitent's task is to practice doing good, just like the athlete practices swinging the bat and throwing the ball, and the musician rehearses their part of the musical setting. The Liturgy of Pre-Sanctified Gifts is a liturgical office that belongs to all of Christendom. It has enjoyed a resurgence in popularity in Orthodoxy since the mid-20th century. This is essentially an evening service, an older and complex form of Vespers that includes the reception of Holy Communion. This quiet service occurs in dark churches in the evening. The Holy Communion consecrated at the previous Sunday's Eucharistic liturgy is received at the service, a remnant of late antique Christian practice of receiving communion more frequently for spiritual strength and, this is important, in anticipation of Christ's second coming. No other service proclaims a salient Lenten theme than this one. Lent is a vigil of quiet, austere waiting, a quiet dialogue with God, very much patterned after Jesus's 40 days in the wilderness, and more on that in a few minutes. There are 2 intense weeks of Lent that tend to touch people in special ways. One of those, which we mentioned before, is Clean Week, the first week of Lent. The other is the 5th week of Lent. On the 5th Thursday of Lent, some churches read a long poem by Saint Andrew of Crete. They also include a public reading of the life of Saint Mary of Egypt. These hagiographical narratives tend to be long, so this is a long service. St. Andrew's Canon was composed as a series of hymns to be read for a monk in the process of dying. It is an incredible and often very difficult series of personal laments. St. Andrew's Canon ultimately made its way into the first week of Lent. It was originally appointed to the 5th week. So these examples that I'm going to read aloud to you are taken from what is now assigned to Wednesday of the first week on the second hymn, or what we call Ode 2 in the Byzantine tradition. To whom will I liken thee, O soul of many sins? Alas, to Cain and to Lamech, for thou hast stoned thy body to death with thine evil deeds and killed thy mind with disordered longings. Call to mind, my soul, all who lived before the law. Thou hast not been like Seth, or followed Enos or Enoch, which was translated to heaven, or Noah, but thou art found destitute, without a share in the life of the righteous. And then for Saint Mary of Egypt, or sort of a reflection on her life. With all eagerness and love, thou hast run to Christ, turning from thy former path of sin, finding thy food in the trackless wilderness, and fulfilling in purity the commandments of God. These quotes are taken from a Lenten Triodi in the thick book that many Orthodox have on their shelves, page 239. Now, St. Andrew's Canon found its way into Lent because of its penitential themes. The 5th week of Lent became a repository of a number of really important liturgical traditions. On the 5th Thursday, the church gathered to sing the penitential canon, an office that again involves a lot of bodily gestures, prostrations and bowing, along with a public reading of the life of St. Mary of Egypt. In the Slavic tradition, as I mentioned before, this lengthy canon of St. Andrew migrated to Clean Week, and it is divided into relatively equal portions, read on each evening Monday through Thursday of that first week. Some Orthodox theologians have called the 5th week of Lent the commemoration of the two Marys because of the coincidence of Mary of Egypt's commemoration with the Akathistos hymn. The Akathistos hymn is a beautiful relic of Greek patristic rhetoric ritualized in liturgy. In the cathedral tradition of Constantinopolitan liturgy, the Kontakion was once the most prominent hymn, a sermon and song consisting of up to 24 stanzas, sung from the famous ambon in the middle of the great church, the Hagia Sophia. The Akathistos hymn is the successor to a much diminished Kontakion, a complete liturgical office. If you look it up online, you'll see that it is often attributed to Saint Romanus the Melodist of the 6th century, but scholars say that the authentic author remains unknown. Note that the Akathist is not particularly Lenten. It seems to have been part of the Annunciation feast on March 25th and then made its way into Lent. The service is the example par excellence of Marian devotion and orthodoxy. Among the people, everyone has a mother. Mary is the people's fervent intercessor before the throne of God, constantly advocating for her people. One cannot overstate how important Mary is among the faithful people. The Akathistos hymn is an elaborate ritual of supplication, begging Jesus' mother, the Theotokos, to intercede before God's throne on our behalf. A last word in conclusion. What then is Lent? This crash course on Orthodox Lent leads to the fundamental question, what is Lent? In our time, I think that most people might say that Lent is a bright sadness, a definition coined by the famous Orthodox theologian Alexander Schmemann. Those more academically oriented might ask if Lent is preparation for baptism, or perhaps an intense period that begins the journey to Easter. I draw from both history and Schmemann to make a bold claim. Lent is about becoming truly human, the beginning of a process of becoming that requires learning how to give and how to receive, how to love, and how to be loved. Schmemann once said something that one might ridicule. He said that Lent shows us how things should normally be. Some ridicule this idea because who wants to sustain long church services with fasting and vigils beyond 6 weeks? Schmemann meant that all of these practices point to a way of life, a habit that is the norm for citizens of God's reign or the kingdom of God. To take heed of one's own actions and words, to adopt humility, to do no harm, to depend upon God. There is no such thing as experiencing Jesus' passion. No one of us can touch the unfathomable depths of God's love that caused the creator of all to take on flesh and die on the cross. Jesus does call us, however, to join him in night prayer and vigil. The Holy Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness for 40 days where he depended utterly upon God, where he prayed and in the process of praying, heard God speaking to him. This Lenten period is for everyone, to devote a period of time to be freed from the things that distract us from hearing God speaking to us. If we are willing to try, God makes it possible for us to become the people God intended us to be in the beginning. The words of the hymn sung at Forgiveness Vespers round this out for us. Let us begin the fast with joy. Indeed, may your Lent be filled with the joy of keeping vigil to meet Christ on Easter. And before I hand it back to Pastor Kate, and thank you for your attention to this first part, I do want to invite you to the second part of this lecture, which will include egg cracking contests, burgers at 3 a.m., nonstop singing, and tossing eggs to the faithful during the service, an overview of Easter in the Orthodox Church. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be glad now to take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Denisenko. I'm going to just be silent for a moment or so and then allow you all the time to add your questions to the chat box, and then we will begin. Dr. Denisenko, one thought I had while you were sharing this with us is that in introducing Lenten practices to Christians from other branches of the church, you could have gone about this in a multitude of ways, from addressing theological differences or going back to historical differences, and yet you really chose to focus in on practices and the everyday life of Christians. So I wondered if you could share with us a little more about why the practices were what you chose to focus on in these talks.
That's a great question. Thanks, Pastor Kate. I'm going to answer this question in two ways. You know, I did my doctoral work, and much of my work has focused on liturgical studies and sacramental theology. So this is scientific work. We don't often think of it that way, especially in days that we talk about following the science, right? We're thinking about microscopes and looking at viruses, or maybe going on an archaeological dig. And all of these are very important sciences, but theology is one of those sciences. And that science really introduced, I think, scholars beginning as early as the 18th century and beyond, possibly even earlier than that, to manuscript study, to studying texts. But one of the things that became apparent at looking at the liturgy itself is that there is a grave danger in reducing seasons, themes, commemorations, holidays, and the gatherings that we take for granted, whether that be baptism, confirmation, the rite of marriage, daily prayer, or Eucharist, divine liturgy, Holy Communion, whatever word that we use to describe it. These are not texts. We use texts in the course of studying these things, but these are events. And they're events that involve human beings coming together, assembling for worship in the body. Now, I realize I'm saying this through the mediation of Zoom and the mediation of a screen. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who in the last year have only been able to worship through a screen. And it's interesting, before all of this started, I kind of thought, well, that's kind of a dubious practice, right? How can you really confront the other person in a positive way in the assembly if you're doing it in a screen? A screen makes you more of a spectator. And of course, that's a longer discussion and there are more limitations to it. But I think what's important is that if you read the studies on how people use apps for prayer and use screens to participate in worship, they still have strong bodily rituals. It's really very much a bodily thing to come together and to move in motion. Sometimes moving in motion to the screen, sometimes stepping in tune with one another in procession. And so liturgy itself is an event. It's an ordered event. And that's kind of the first part of it, is that the more that I got into liturgical studies, the more that I came to understand that the meaning comes from the event itself, just as much from the context, from everything else that's happening, as it does in the text. So for example, if you're teaching worship and you tell your students, okay, go to a church and observe the worship and then come back and report to me what you learned, what you'll find is that the most profound learning comes from the things that they saw happening that people were actually doing. And it often produces surprises, things that we wouldn't think about. We might think, for example, that the Great Thanksgiving or Eucharistic prayer is the most profound theological thing that we could think of in a text, when if you send someone out into the community, they'll say, you know what, it was when that body of people was moving and they were bodies in motion, or they were singing together. In fact, I think I recall, maybe someone remembers this, the great Aidan Kavanaugh said in his book on liturgical theology, he quoted Augustine as saying that he was moved and really came to understand what Christianity was by hearing the thunderous amens that the people said together when they gathered together for worship. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it, I really owe to a study on, it's an ethnographic sociological survey of converts to the Orthodox Church, published in 2011 by the author Amy Slagle. Slagle profiles a handful of parishes and the process that people experienced when they were preparing to be received into the Orthodox Church. And one of the most interesting things she learned, and I think that this comes out in many other kind of catechetical types of programs, is that people learn a lot more by doing than they do by reading. So for example, if you had a text that told you what an icon was, that could be very useful. But if you actually go into a church and you encounter an icon and you see people making the sign of the cross and in non-pandemic times kissing the icon, you ask yourself, wow, there's something else really interesting happening here.
Yeah.
So that's what, I actually have a book out that asks people about their experiences at liturgy, and I wish I could write a sequel to it, and maybe I will someday, because I think that we really learn by doing. And I'll tell you, folks, in 2022, when this is over, we should embrace the opportunity to worship all together again and to visit one another's, because if you really want to know what the church believes, the old adage lex orandi est lex credendi, you'll learn what the church believes, who they are, by participating in their worship.
Those are great reflections. Thank you. We have a couple of really great questions in the chat box. The first one is, how does forgiveness of self, in addition to forgiveness of others, fit into the season of Lent?
That is a wonderful question. There's a lot of talk going on now about reconciliation, about forgiveness, and also about vulnerability. So, I'm just going to give one example that I think you could take in a number of ways. One of the most influential preparations for baptism in terms of a late antique text in Christianity is attributed to the Bishop Cyril of Jerusalem from the 4th century. Scholars don't agree on who the actual author was, but that's not really important here. And it was probably Cyril. He gave 5 lectures on each day after Easter to people who had just become Christian. These people were probably somewhat privileged and wealthy. And his lectures, if there's one theme that kind of threads through them, it's a warning. It's a warning to understand the decision that you have made to become Christian and what that actually means for you. And as part of that warning, he uses this kind of language that we have to handle with great care. And he's talking about renouncing the devil, which is a big part of old Jerusalem liturgy and still is in many of the Eastern Christian rites, to renounce the devil and to perform exorcisms in preparation for baptism. And he basically says, once you've embarked on this new way of life, once you want to go on that new way of life, you don't go back to where you were. And he uses in this setting, from reflecting upon Genesis, what happened to Lot's wife. So I'll let you, Pastor Kate, use that as a quiz for students that you work with here. So what happened to Lot's wife, right? So we know she turned into a pillar of salt when she looked back behind her, and it's this really kind of dramatic moment. But I think we can take an example like that and turn it into a positive, keeping in mind that forgiveness is hard work that's never finished. You don't ever get a master's or a PhD in forgiveness. It's something that we're constantly practicing because we're trying to learn how to do it and how to receive it. So in response to the question of forgiveness of self, I think that in this instance, it really is attached to this notion of receiving forgiveness. Once God has unleashed and poured out divine grace that forgives one of that sins, one is liberated from that. It's liberation. You never have to go back to that. And people will say, well, what happens to remembering these things that happened in the past? Does that matter anymore? Does that mean that we try to forget? And I think that here there's another lesson at play. Let's think about alcoholics who attend Alcoholics Anonymous. Being a good penitent and being forgiven of sin is learning how to say, I am the first among sinners. And so there's a burden that comes with receiving the forgiveness of God and receiving the forgiveness of the other. And that's to truly allow ourselves to be liberated, to be free from everything that came with that package. And I think the last thing that I would say about that, and I've been thinking about this for a while and writing about it and hope to write more, is that no one should ever try to do this alone. I think it's very important to have at least one companion who will journey with you on this, who will at the very least listen to you or help you bear that burden of forgiving oneself. I think, Renee, that's a huge part of Lent that goes into the everyday. It may very well be that this prayer of St. Ephrem that's recited every day, this prayer for humility, in part that humility is to not take pride in dwelling upon the fact that I'm a sinner, but instead to be thankful for this amnesty that Christians have been given quite freely by God. It's a tough question because it's a lot of hard work and it requires a lot of grace, which is why Christians continue to practice it together. I think what would be really important, and this is, I'll kind of end with this, is to make sure that we don't ignore this in pastoral parish settings, but really, name it and talk about it as one part of a larger package of receiving that healing grace.
Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts on forgiveness. I know that's a topic that Christians everywhere struggle with every day and all the time, and it's an important part of our faith. And I'm especially taking away that phrase of like constantly practicing forgiveness, that it's not a one and done thing, but even accepting God's forgiveness for ourselves is a daily practice in being a Christian and understanding what that liberation means. So thank you for all of that. Another question, it comes attached to a story. I went to a university with a Reformed Christian background. While there, I found out that certain Protestant denominations allow for believers to break fasting on each Sunday during Lent. I'd like to ask if the professor has heard about this and why this is possible.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that okay, let me just back up here. Let me start with a little bit of liturgical history. Sunday is the original feast day of the commemoration of the resurrection of Christ. If we look at the New Testament accounts, Christ appears to his disciples as the risen Lord and breaks bread with them on the first day of the week. And so the celebration of the Eucharist that so influenced Christians in the beginning, and I realize you're writing this from a Reformed Christian background, so it's hard for me to say how important or how frequent Eucharist is for you, so I'll try to put this together. Nevertheless, it's a sense, Sunday has always carried with it a sense of being the original Easter. I take way too much pleasure when I teach liturgical studies in saying that it's not right to call Sunday a little Easter. It's the original Easter. It is the full celebration of being with the risen Lord. And there is this principle that the disciples of the Lord don't fast when the bridegroom is with them. In fact, I know on an individual basis, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox pastors and faithful who think that it's really antithetical to Sunday as a solemn day that we still observe even during Lent to fast on that day. So that I think, first of all, that even if you look at a pretty austere Eastern Christian tradition that goes all the way back, if you read the diary of the pilgrimage area to Jerusalem, the fasting that they did during Lent there in the 4th century sounds almost impossible. It was so hard. And these weren't monks, these were just everyday people. When we think about this, the fasting rules are pretty austere. They demand a lot if you try to follow them. So even there are some Orthodox who say, it's just antithetical to the Sunday tradition to fast on Sundays. And there's a sort of acknowledgement of this, is that Sunday is one of the days where the fasting rules are slightly relaxed. You can have olive oil, you can have fish, you can have wine in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And there are communities that might go a little bit further there. So I think that this is something that Christians need to discuss. The 20th century witnessed to a rehabilitation of Sunday as the original solemnity of Christianity. If you buy any decent textbook on the meaning of the liturgical year, it contains a whole section on the relationship between Sunday and Sabbath. So I think that there's something, one can make an argument in favor for the relaxation of fasting rules on Sundays, keeping in mind, again, really, in all honesty, these are blueprints and patterns. We do the best that we can with them, but sometimes we just have to adapt. To say that the fasting rules allow lobster and shrimp, really, you're really stretching to say that kind of fulfills the spirit of the fast. So I would call for having some respect for breaking bread and celebrating the Eucharist for those traditions that do on Sundays. This is a big thing, and to celebrate the Eucharist is to break the Eucharistic fast. We're not fasting from offering the Eucharist. And that's another aspect here that we haven't even gotten into yet, which we would perhaps on another occasion. So I wouldn't be too hard on those traditions that don't fast on Sundays. I think that they're just trying to respect the original significance of what Sundays are. Sorry, I went on for a little bit on that one.
No, that's great. I think that's something that a lot of us do need clarification on, as we don't get a lot of education daily about those old rituals, like Sunday being a day of celebration. So I appreciate the detail that you went into. As a final question, we're returning, I think, back to that topic of forgiveness. And Mo notes that in throughout your lecture and then in your answer to the forgiveness question, you really emphasize community. And he asked, but what if there is no one who will embark with you on that journey of self-forgiveness? In a place of religious isolation, for example, how does one practice this idea alone?
That's a great That's a great question. It's not that I'm stumped, but I'm trying to grasp for some of the words. I'm going to use the example here of two saints, one of whom I mentioned. There are kind of two paradigmatic saints that are really very compatible with the spirit of Lent. They fulfill the ideal. One is Saint Anthony of Egypt, the original ascetic, the often considered to be the founder of what we call anchoritic monasticism, the founder of being a hermit. And then the second one is Mary of Egypt. And if you ever listen to that life or read it, you will see that she sought to be alone. And she struggled, in fact, with this notion of self-forgiveness. In both of these stories, both of the saints wanted to be alone, but other people were drawn to them. So in St. Mary's of Egypt's example, the elder Zosima, who left the monastery, which is where we get the source information for the beginning of Forgiveness Sunday and its origins, he is sent into the desert to find the elder who will teach him the things that he never learned before. So he goes there to meet someone who's trying to not be around people. And so part of the lesson is here that at least ideally, everyone is meant to, at some point, come into contact with someone. So there are a couple of ways to look at this. First of all, I think that Lent invites all Christian faithful to spend some time in solitude and to be alone with the Lord. I mean, the examples from the Gospels are numerous where Jesus goes off alone to pray in quiet. You know, sometimes he invites his disciples with him, and of course they always fail, but he often goes alone. So there is a place for this. And I recently wrote a piece where I said, you know, I think that that can be a very useful thing. So I think that it's good in some sense, but there's a difference between solitude and loneliness. And what would concern me is to try to do everything by oneself. So my answer to your question might not satisfy it. I think when we are alone, we do the best that we can. I really do understand. I've often felt this way myself. I know people have felt this way, that we think, well, maybe there is no one on that journey, no one who will come with us on that journey of self-forgiveness. So a couple of things that I would say. First of all, I think that this is a message to the Christian community that one of the things that the community needs to pray for is that they would be sent to those who need a companion on the journey. It can be very easy to become self-absorbed in these moments of self-examination and of solitude, and especially now, of course, right? When we all have this privacy that we can carve out for ourselves during the pandemic. So one of the things that needs to happen is that the community needs to be aware of who else is in the community who might be alone. You know, that would be the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is it possible to go on this journey and maybe find a companion who doesn't have a specific religious affiliation, but who's willing to walk with you on that journey? You know, if God could send Cyrus to liberate the Hebrew people from the Babylonian captivity, God doesn't do things the way that we do them. God turns everything upside down. And those stories are always, I think, a reminder to us that God can act in ways to do things that are for our sake, for our blessing, that might not seem conventional to us. So part of this lesson might be to seek someone, even if that someone is outside of your religious tradition, who's willing to take a walk with you. And my bet, my hope, and my prayer will be that God will send that person, and that the community will become more aware of needing to reach out and be aware of those who are in isolation, so that they don't have to embark on that journey alone. So anyone out there who's saying, hey, we need more lay ministry, I think this is one of those examples of it's there, it's ready to be taken. We just need to get to know the people who are around us. So that's not a perfect answer. I know that, but I do think that I hope that that gives some insight into ways that we might think about it, keeping in mind that some solitude is good. It's good for us to spend some of that time in quiet and in stillness, and to be assured that we are freed from the sins that we have truly repented of.
Amen. Well, Dr. Denisenko, thank you so much again for this opportunity to learn from you and to ask you questions even at the end. And thanks to everyone who is here with us tonight. We are appreciative of your presence and your questions, and we hope you will join us. What was the date for your second lecture again, Dr. Denisenko?
The date is April 22nd. I'm going to just throw it in the chat here at 7 p.m. at the same time. It will be on Orthodox Easter. And my plan is also to have a surprise of another announcement to come that I'll hold off on until then.
Wonderful. Well, blessings to everyone on your Lenten journey, whether it started yet or not. And we hope to see you again in the future. Take care.
Take care. Thank you, Pastor Kate, and thanks to all of you.